This podcast is sponsored by FOI Law. Picture this: a data subject access request has just landed on your desk. You've got 30 days to go through 40,000 documents across email, Slack, and 3 shared drives. And your review process is Adobe Acrobat and a lot of coffee. Sound familiar? That's the problem FOI Law solves. It's the platform purpose-built for document disclosures, subject access requests, FOI, the lot. So instead of redacting PDFs one by one or forcing litigation software to do a job it wasn't designed for, with FOI Law, you get collection, review, and redaction in one workflow built around the 1-month clock. Teams across EMEA are using it to cut response times from weeks to days. And for Guardians of Data listeners, FOI Law is offering a 2-month free trial. Run it on live requests, see what it does to your backlog, and decide from there. No card, no commitment. Head to FOIS.law/guardians to claim your free trial. That's FOIS.law/guardians. Welcome to Guardians of Data, the show where we explore the world of information law and information governance, from privacy and AI to cybersecurity and freedom of information. I'm Ibrahim Hassan. In each episode, we'll be speaking with experts and practitioners to unpack the big issues shaping the IG profession. In the past few weeks alone, we've seen a stark reminder of why transparency in public life isn't an abstract principle. It's a democratic necessity. The release of millions of documents linked to Jeffrey Epstein has triggered, amongst other things, the sacking of a UK ambassador to the United States, the arrest of the 8th in line to the throne, political fallout, and renewed questions about what powerful figures knew, shared, and concealed. At the same time, the UK COVID inquiry continues to expose the hidden infrastructure of government decision-making, from disputes over access to ministers' WhatsApp messages to concerns about disappearing communications and record-keeping practices. And Westminster is once again confronting questions about standards in public life, vetting, and the integrity of those in positions of authority. Taken together, these stories highlight something fundamental. Transparency isn't simply about releasing information after the fact. It's about how decisions are recorded, how power is exercised, and whether democratic institutions can be trusted to hold themselves to account. To discuss these issues, we have a guest who has been at the heart of the movement for transparency for decades, well before the Freedom of Information Act came into force. I'm thrilled to be joined by Maurice Frankel OBE, Director of the Campaign for Freedom of Information. Maurice drafted the successful Private Members Bills, which subsequently became the Access to Personal Files Act 1987 and the Access to Health Records Act 1990, amongst others. He was also a member of the Lord Chancellor's Advisory Group on the implementation of the Freedom of Information Act. Welcome to the show, Maurice.
Well, thank you for having me, Ibrahim.
Lovely to have you, Maurice. You've been at the forefront of the transparency movement in the UK for decades. Can you tell us how you first became involved in the campaign and what drew you to this field of transparency and accountability?
Well, in a previous job, I've been working for a non-government organization called Social Audit. And I was working on access to information and a report on the government air pollution inspectorate in those days, which was called the Alkali Inspectorate. And disclosure was not a thing that it was very familiar with or very enthusiastic about. And so we produced a report about that. And then Des Wilson, who set up the campaign, brought me in to do some work with him when he was chair of Friends of the Earth on access to environmental information, and then asked me to work for the campaign when the campaign was launched at the beginning of 1984. So I've worked with the campaign since then.
Des Wilson, if I remember correctly, he was a Liberal politician?
He was president of the Liberal Democrats at one point before one of the elections in the 1980s. And he was a very prominent campaigner, very well known for his work on shelter, information about homelessness, Friends of the Earth, and the campaign for lead-free air, amongst others, where he launched very effective campaigns on all of those issues, and then on freedom of information.
So that's interesting that the campaign started off as a result of concerns about the environment.
Yes, and the immediate prompt was the campaign for lead-free air, where
Mm.
the government was denying that the evidence on the effect of lead on children was to damage children's brains. And then there was a leak of information from the chief medical officer of health, which actually showed that he believed that that was the truth. And the leak of that information made it impossible for the government to maintain its line against removing lead from petrol. And Des Wilson recognized that secrecy was the great enemy of people seeking changes in government policy because the government could suppress the information that supported its critics' views and release only the information which supported its own position. And that led directly to the setting up of the Campaign for Freedom of Information.
So we know it took many years for the actual legislation to come into force, 1st of January 2005. What was life like before freedom of information? How easy was it to obtain information from the public sector?
It was extremely difficult in most cases unless the information you were asking for was helpful for the public authorities position, in which case the authority would be prepared to release it. But if you asked for information which might question its position, then it was very difficult to get the information. And officials, council leaders, and ministers would treat the information as if it was their own personal information. And they'd sometimes be affronted that you would even ask and expect that information to be disclosed.
And I suppose that's the shift change to the FOI, where the message is that it's the public's information. They have a right to know. So that's not surprising that initially public sector officials were thinking it's theirs and you can have it if it doesn't cause us embarrassment, and probably end up with a very sanitized version of the information anyway.
Well, that's right. That's exactly right. And I mean, what we were saying and still believe is where public authorities, without being forced to by the Information Commissioner's intervention, act in accordance with the Freedom of Information Act and disclose information, even though it's inconvenient to themselves or potentially embarrassing to themselves. That is the kind of act that can improve public confidence and public trust in the authority when it's apparent that they are not going out of their way, despite FOI, to try and suppress embarrassing information, but are prepared to disclose it in accordance with the Act.
And interesting you mentioned public trust, because it's well documented that public trust in government, particularly politicians, is at an all-time low. And so anything that's going to improve that trust and trust in the democratic process is particularly important, especially the way the world is going at the moment. We know, of course, Maurice, that the Freedom of Information Act received royal assent in November 2000, but only came fully into force on the 1st of January 2005 with the implementation of Section 1, the full right of access. What caused the delay between 2000 and 2005? Because I remember it was a Labour government manifesto promise, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, the cover story was that it would give public authorities time to get their records into good order, so they would be able to introduce proper record management practices in the intervening period. I think the real concern to government was that this would cause government a lot of problems, which they hadn't anticipated at the outset of committing themselves to the legislation, and they wanted to put it off as long as possible. And I think you saw the result of that in disclosures about Tony Blair's government taking money from Ecclestone, the head of Formula One racing, where it was alleged that Formula One was excluded from Labour's ban on advertising tobacco at sports events. It was always alleged that that was a quid pro quo for money that Ecclestone had given Labour. Uh, Tony Blair rejected that suggestion, but by the time the information came out in response to a Freedom of Information request, Blair had left office years earlier and was no longer directly affected by the disclosure. And it may well be that the delay was partly to allow enough time to pass before a potentially embarrassing information came out during the lifetime of the Blair administration.
Years later, Tony Blair described himself famously as a nincompoop, and one of his worst decisions was to bring in freedom of legislation. Surprising considering it was a manifesto promise. What were the other challenges in terms of getting the actual legislation onto the statute books?
Well, the fact is the government realized, Blair realized once the legislation was going through Parliament that this was something that would cause them problems. And it came to the point at which the government privately threatened to pull the FOI bill from Parliament if further improvements to the bill were made during its parliamentary progress. And Jack Straw, who was the Home Secretary and the Justice Minister, his memoirs confirm that that was the case, that the government actively considered dropping the FOI bill before it became law for fear that it had gone too far, that it was providing too much openness. And we were told at one point that a meeting was about to take place, which would, and the official said to me, which would decide whether we have to go on talking to you. And that was an indirect reference to the fact they were considering dropping the bill that was at that time going through Parliament. And so that was a serious threat to the legislation, as well as an explanation of why they put it off for so long.
You mentioned further improvements. So, in a parallel universe, what would FOI have been like with these further improvements?
Well, the improvement that they were seeking to oppose at that time was making the public interest test mandatory and subject to the Information Commissioner's jurisdiction. So the bill, as it started life, had a voluntary public interest test. All exemptions were absolute exemptions. There was a public interest test, but it was a purely voluntary one, which authorities would apply themselves, but could not be required to comply with by the Information Commissioner. And this was the great final battle that took place over the bill. And in Parliament, Jack Straw argued that were this to become law, every public authority should have a right of veto over decisions taken on public interest grounds. So the idea was that the authority would decide for themselves where the public interest lay, and if the commission was given the power to make rulings, the authority would still have a veto over those rulings. And that was whittled away during the later stages of the House of Commons passage of the bill, so that initially only elected authorities would have that power. That meant local government would have it, as well as central government. And then finally, local government was dropped from having access to the veto, and the veto was retained only for central government. And that was how government persuaded itself that it could live with a binding public interest test that could ultimately escape the binding nature of the test, which we thought was completely unnecessary because they had such an elaborate right of appeal. The initial decision could be challenged by going to the Information Commissioner, then by going to the tribunal, and then by a challenge to at that time, the High Court, and now the Upper Tribunal on a point of law. We just said it's not necessary to have a veto. You have got multiple opportunities to demonstrate under a proper procedure why the decision to order disclosure is wrong.
So, from the campaign's perspective, obviously, your most significant win is to get the legislation onto the statute books. What other wins would you say you've had over the years?
Well, our work since the Act came into force has been on providing advice and assistance and training to requesters, and also doing some case law updating for public authorities. And I think the most interesting thing is that you've got a number of requesters who've acquired substantial expertise of their own in handling FOI requests and can make sophisticated arguments based in case law about why an authority's decision is wrong, why the ICO's decision sometimes is wrong, and why the tribunal should reverse a refusal. I think that is a very important part of the way the legislation has developed. And so too is the fact that we have some freedom of information officers who take a very positive approach to the legislation and are a force in favor of disclosure or in favor of compliance with the Act internally within the public authorities, so that it's not left solely to external pressure or to the Information Commissioner, but they're also advocates of openness within public authorities.
I'd certainly agree that there are advocates for transparency within public authorities, particularly in the information governance department, people who actually believe in openness and transparency as a concept, but also believe that it, in the long run, helps the organization create public trust. Turning, if I may, to the Epstein scandal, Morris, the United States has published investigation documents in relation to Jeffrey Epstein, consisting of 3 million pages, almost 200,000 images, and 2,000 videos. I was just wondering if there are any examples of large scale disclosures of information in the UK, similar to the disclosure of the Epstein files in the United States.
We can look at the major public inquiries in the UK to see massive disclosure of previously confidential information, going back to the BSE inquiry and more recently to the COVID inquiry and the post office inquiries, where we have had huge disclosures of previously confidential information, which has very often been withheld despite FOI. I don't think it's realistic to expect that level of disclosure on a routine basis under FOI because effectively it strips away a lot of the FOI exemptions and requires disclosure regardless of them, except in very rare cases where the inquiry is persuaded that a specific disclosure would be harmful. So we do get similar disclosures in the UK, and they reveal what has not become public despite FOI. I think that illustrates the limitation of FOI in many cases. Um, Part of the limitation is information is sometimes withheld in order not to prejudice the inquiry itself.
Can you give us some examples of inquiries where this has happened, Morris?
Well, we see this in people trying to get information about the Hillsborough inquiry were refused on this basis. People trying to get information about the COVID inquiry and the VIP channel and so on were refused on this basis. Now, it may be that some of the disclosures were being requested at a time when policy formulation was still taking place or contracts were still being considered to be let. But uh, at the end of the day, the difference between what FOIA produces and what these inquiries produce is very, very substantial. And I suppose the inquiry allows an informed commentary to be made alongside the documents, which might not be the case if they were simply released under freedom of information.
Mm. And just back to Epstein, Morris, we know that the US government published these documents more so because of political pressure. I know that obviously, once that pressure came, much legislation was passed in terms of the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Is it a case where it shows that in the end, no matter what kind of legislation you have on the statute books, political pressure is sometimes the stronger force to get documents and information out in the open?
Well, political pressure is always a major force and very often effective in overturning refusals. But I think one of the things to bear in mind is people didn't know where to look. We had Everybody appreciated that the Epstein inquiry was about sexual abuse of girls and women, mainly young girls.
Mm,
Nobody appreciated that a side effect of these disclosures was to reveal the nature of the relationship between Peter Mandelson and Prince Andrew and Epstein himself, and the extent to which that involved the disclosure of government information, which would be helpful to Epstein's commercial interests or could have been used by him for commercial benefit, which should not have been disclosed. Now, I think the interesting thing is, had people been pointed in that direction or had it understood that that was an implication, some of that information might have been disclosable under properly targeted FOI requests, because we know that disclosures by improper disclosures by government ministers have sometimes been disclosed under FOI, where the requester has sussed out that that might be happening and has asked for the information. So Suella Braverman's disclosures as Home Secretary were revealed under FOIA, and I
mm.
think that shows that with a properly targeted request, some of this very sensitive and embarrassing evidence of obvious misconduct can be obtained, perhaps guided by whistleblowers sometimes, or perhaps guided by the understanding that requesters have acquired about what appears to have been going on. And so I think
Yes.
it doesn't happen on a kind of mass scale of millions of documents being disclosed in one go, because the cost limit obviously prevents anything remotely approaching that. But a
Mm.
properly targeted request can still succeed even in very difficult situations where the information is highly embarrassing to political figures.
But I suppose, as you say, you need to know what you're looking for, have some external sort of information that you can have confirmed through the FOI disclosure. The difference here is that millions of documents have been published, and now it's very much a question of journalists and others trawling through. And perhaps we're going to see more FOI requests to government about a lot of the activities of the people surrounding Epstein, his circle, so to speak.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. Once that data is out there, people will be able to take the argument further by pressing for specific information. It then becomes much harder for government to refuse it once it's clear that this is not just suspicion operating, but based on clear indicators in previously published material.
You mentioned the cost limit. Now, it's interesting that just this morning there's a story in the BBC that whistleblowing retired civil servants claimed that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor charged taxpayers for massages and excessive travel costs whilst he was working as the UK's trade envoy. Of course, he's denied all wrongdoing, and there's no suggestion that he's actually committed a criminal offence. But the BBC says that the civil servants first contacted the author who's written a book about Andrew. It's called Entitled. Andrew Lowney, the author, says that he's made multiple requests to government. A lot of them have been rejected on the grounds of costs. One rejection said that 1 year of Andrew's time as trade envoy would mean going through almost 2,000 digital files, each containing multiple pieces of information. Do you think there's a case here, Maurice, for the cost limit rules to be changed so that where there is a strong public interest, the rules no longer apply, so they can't be refused on the grounds of costs if there's a strong public interest in disclosing the information?
Well, I think there's a good case for that. We argued for that when the FOI bill was going through Parliament, because it was obvious that you had an absolute limit on what could be disclosed based on the time needed to find it, essentially. And there was no way through that. And that limit applied in the same way to a request about the purchase of government stationery and to information the government held about a life-threatening disease or potential pandemic. And the case for treating those differently and recognizing the public interest in serious cases, I think is very strong. Now, government will argue that everybody will make a public interest case for disclosure, but everybody does make a public interest case for disclosure of information about commercial interests, law enforcement matters, and so on. And the exemption does not collapse in every case simply because somebody makes that argument. It gives way when there is genuine evidence there which justifies a disclosure of otherwise exempt information. I think the same could take place if there was a public interest test applying to the cost limit.
You mentioned previously with regards to inquiries and their power to seek information from government. The COVID inquiry is ongoing. We've learned lots of things. The use of unofficial communications such as WhatsApp, Signal, and Google Chat by ministers and advisors. And in some cases, them using disappearing messages. What does that say to you about attitudes to transparency when it comes to the major decisions, particularly around COVID?
Well, a chunk of the history will have been lost forever. It may be that there's enough been recorded to make up for that in the main areas. But I think the use of auto deletion signaling or messaging software is a very unhealthy development. And if it's possible to prevent officials using that, even where they need to use messaging software for efficiency purposes, they should not be able to use software which automatically deletes messages once they've been read or within 24 hours of having been read. I think I think that is inimical to proper record keeping practices, to accountability, and to the operation of the Freedom of Information Act.
Do you think that, bearing in mind the fallout from the Epstein scandal and also the COVID inquiry so far, is it going to lead to improvements in government transparency or is it going to lead to more unrecorded decisions?
Well, I think the surprising thing is that very embarrassing material has come out of the Post Office inquiry, for example, about the real reasons for the continuing with various practices, despite the fact that it was well known that the Post Office was subject to the Freedom of Information Act and was receiving Freedom of Information requests. So I think what is perhaps more surprising is how much of that information has survived despite the existence of freedom of information. I mean, when the Act was being discussed in the early days, the government would argue that people would use post-it notes to record sensitive information so that these could be pulled off the documents when a freedom of information request was obtained. And so they believed that the threat of disclosure would prevent anything significant, which could be embarrassing, being recorded in a permanent form at all. And that's not proved to be the case. And I think that is probably because, first of all, the chances, I think officials will recognize that they're dealing with vast volumes of documents, and very few of those were ever requested under freedom of information. That means the ordinary incentive to carry on recording information in the ordinary way or sending recorded information to colleagues in the ordinary way carries on, despite what in practice may be a hypothetical possibility of a freedom of information request being received at some later stage. So the information is not that vulnerable to preemptive destruction to
Mm.
prevent disclosure. I think that is perhaps a reassuring result of these inquiries.
I agree with you, Maurice, that having had over 20 years of freedom of information legislation, we are seeing the government disclosing more information, sometimes embarrassing as well. And certainly the inquiry system is disclosing more information perhaps than the Freedom of Information Act would have allowed. So together, I think I agree, we have made progress. But do you think there is still room for improvement? Do you think certain public authorities need to improve more than others?
Well, I think there's room for improvement across the board. I think there's a number of things. I think the first thing is I think authorities are sometimes too keen to impute bad motive to a requester, just as requesters are sometimes too keen to impute bad motive to a public authority for withholding information. We saw a very interesting case recently where a police force concluded that a requester was vexatious for making requests under different variations of his own name. They took that as evidence of an intention to dissociate himself from his history of previous requests. Actually, the Information Commissioner recognized when it came on the scene that what the request was trying to do was withhold information from being disclosed publicly on whatdotheyknow.com, which is what he was using. And when the commission asked him about the use of his different names, he immediately acknowledged he was responsible for a whole series of requests. But he said that was simply not why he was using different names. I think a second problem is that public authorities are not making proper use of Boolean searches, as far as I can tell. That is, they're not searching for term A combined with search term B, but excluding search term C. They are simply looking for hits under particular search terms and not intelligently using the ability that their systems in many cases must have to narrow the request by proper use of of search language. So I think that needs to be looked at. I also think that the Act itself needs to be amended to address some of the shortcomings that the Act itself creates. And chief of those is the reasonable extension to consider the public interest test. So the 20 working days is extendable by an unspecified reasonable period to consider the public interest test. I think that extension should be got rid of, just
Mm.
as the environmental information regulations have got rid of it, and the Scotland Freedom of Information Act has never adopted that approach.
While ago, the Information Commissioner was criticizing a number of government departments for using that as a way of extending the time limit and delaying responses.
Yeah, that's and there were cases of government department or public authorities taking 12 successive 20 working day extensions to consider the public interest test. And the fact is, they do not need an extension to consider the public interest test. If the authority is considering whether an exemption applies, they can at the same time consider whether disclosure on public interest grounds is required. That's part of the balancing exercise that actually is a single exercise. I mean,
Mm.
it will be obvious to the authority that in some cases there is a minor triggering of the exemption. So it's technically triggered, but there's actually no need to rely on it, and the public interest in disclosure justifies the disclosure of technically exempt information. They do not need an extra 20 or 40 working days to separately consider the public interest. It's part of the exercise that takes place when they consider whether an exemption applies. I think that should be dealt with, and I think it'd be helpful if authorities were more willing to adopt disclosure logs so that the public can see what has been disclosed by the authority previously, and that is very often a good indicator of what the authority should be able to do in
Mm.
relation to a new request coming in.
'Cause disclosure logs at the moment, that it's best practice, but it's not a legal requirement.
That's right. It's not a legal requirement. And the best practice is, I think, to disclose information which the authority considers significant. I think those authorities which provide substantial disclosure logs make it a lot easier for requesters to position themselves in relation to the authority in making new requests.
And it saves time for the public authority. They're not inundated with requests for the same information, and saves the time of the requester because they can see what's already been disclosed. So makes sense.
And I mean, that's why the What Do They Know website is such a valuable resource for requesters, and good disclosure logs where they exist are a good resource. And I know that although some authorities have suggested that a disclosure log simply encourages people to make more requests, which they're not necessarily keen to receive, a few years ago, Barnet in London documented the fact that the combination of their disclosure logs and the data sets which they had published had cut the number of FOI requests they received in certain areas, notably parking and council tax, by I think up to a third, because the requesters were able to answer their questions from what was publicly available from the authority on its website. So I think there are benefits to the authority in disclosing information in this way, both through disclosure logs and proactively in areas of frequently requested information.
Absolutely. Where do you think FOI is going in terms of the legislation itself? If we get a change of government to a more right wing government, do you think you'll be back on the campaign trail trying to save FOI?
Well, we're always aware of the fact that the Act could come under threat at any time. Under the last government, we had the government exempting bodies like the Advanced Research and Invention Research Agency, ARIA, from FOI, or not bringing it under FOI on what frankly looked like spurious grounds that the body needed to be spared unnecessary bureaucracy in order to fulfill its function. Well, I mean, all public authorities could make exactly the same argument. So we are prepared for that. The number of times we have had to come in and try and defend the act against attempts by initially the Blair administration, then the coalition government, a Conservative government, to stop attacks on freedom of information is remarkable. I mean, we had attempts to remove Parliament itself from the scope of the act in the early days. There was an attempt to expand the cost limit so that the cost limit of effectively 18 hours or 24 hours of time spent looking for information would apply not to a single request or to all similar requests within a 60 working day period, but to all requests by a requester to the same public authority, whether they were related or not. And that would mean that, and not just for from the same individual requester, but from the same organization. So it would mean that major news organizations would be limited to one or two requests to the Home Office in a 3-month period, spread amongst all of their journalists, which was seriously put forward by the Blair administration in the early days. And so I don't underestimate the threat to FOI. The most recent serious threat we had was the government, Conservative government, setting up the Independent Commission on Freedom of Information in the mid-90s, where the unspoken aim was to remove information about policymaking from the scope of FOI altogether. So the unspoken aim of that exercise was to make Section 35, the exemption for the formulation of government policy, and probably Section 36, the exemption for inhibiting the frankness of a device or discussions for all authorities, to make those absolute exemptions not subject to the public interest test. And we did a very detailed analysis of all tribunal decisions over, I think, a 16-month period, relying on Section 35, and showed that in very many cases, the exemption worked as the government had intended it to work.
Mm.
That is, it protected sensitive discussions from disclosure even after the decision had been taken. But that in a number of cases where the public interest justified it, that information was disclosed. And the tribunal accepted that that was the exemption and the public interest test working as it was supposed to, and that there should be no change to that position. And so I think that was a very important milestone in the act, because that resulted in the government, before the final report was published, announcing that it hoped the independent commission would not require any weakening of the Freedom of Information Act. Whereas a weakening of the Freedom of Information Act had been the whole purpose of setting up the
Yeah.
commission in the first place.
Mm. That's interesting. Just going back across the pond, the US President, Donald Trump, has said that he's going to direct US agencies to release government files on aliens and extraterrestrial life. Of course, in the UK, that would be covered by the Defense and National Security exemption, I suppose. But on a more serious note, are there any FOI regimes you look at and you think, I wish we had that one?
Well, look, there are a lot of freedom of information regimes which, at least on paper, are much better than the UK's Act. And there is international comparisons which show that we're, you know, about a one-third way down the list of FOI laws, based solely on the statutory provision, not necessarily on how they operate in practice. But I mean, you've got at the top of the list Afghanistan, which has a very good freedom of information law on paper, but which is plainly not being applied in practice. So it's a very complicated exercise to compare FOI laws, and what you sometimes find is the UK's law is better than many others on certain points
Mhm.
and not as good as others on other points. And I think it's a quid pro quo. For example, the US Freedom of Information Act has got no cost limit to it. And the way in which cost is dealt with is by making charges to requesters for search time and for photocopying costs, which can be overturned for the media and organization and requests which are clearly in the public interest. And a combination of that, of charges, plus extremely long backlogs. People used
Mm.
to make freedom of information requests to the FBI and the CIA to all government agencies, for the longest unresolved, unanswered FOI request, and they will go up to 10 years. So we have a trade-off with our cost limit, which is requesters are not allowed to make very voluminous requests because of the cost limit, but there are no charges
Mm.
for information. And there's also a vexatious provision which also assists government in dealing with burdensome requests. But I think the problem is the cost limit bites very hard on requests which the requester does not know how to limit, because they're not given proper information about what the actual costs, what the estimated costs of their requests have been judged to be, and what information could be provided without charge. Now, the ICO's guidance on advice and assistance says that authorities should be doing that. They should be telling them,
Mm.
requesters, what they could get within the cost limit. But in practice, that is very rarely done. And, if somebody makes a multi-part request, they're just told the request is too expensive, complying with the request be too expensive, they should narrow the request, but they're not really told what they should be doing to narrow the request, or which parts of the request could be answered within the existing cost limit,
Mm.
or at 60 working day intervals if they were to spread the request out.
Would you say that perhaps they're not really complying with their duty of advice and assistance under Section 16?
Yeah, I believe that is the case. I think they are being allowed to get away with ask for less information or ask for a shorter period of time and not being held to the test of telling the requester what they could obtain within the cost limit. And I think public authorities ought to be doing that, and the Information Commissioner ought to be doing more to require them to do that.
Finally, Maurice, after so many years of campaigning and working for the Campaign for Freedom of Information, what keeps you passionate about this cause?
Well, I mean, I think it is how some disclosures immediately produce change in authority practice. There are some aspects of what an authority does which can only take place because the public don't know about it. The moment they are exposed, the authority has to put it right because it's clear that they can't be justified. And so the power of some FOI requests to change practice is very encouraging and stimulating. And so is the willingness of some FOI officers to try and press their authorities to comply with the spirit of the legislation. So I'd say those are the two things that most encourage me about FOI and to continue the work on freedom of information.
And just finally, some words of inspiration for our new professionals listening to the podcast.
Well, try and understand what the rationale for bringing FOI in actually was. And that was that openness serves the public interest. It serves the interest of accountability. It deters bad practice and it exposes unacceptable conduct. Those are all things which authorities should be endorsing, and the FOI officers in particular should see as the benefit of freedom of information, plus the fact that it does, and I in my own experience and in terms where I've been provided by information in the right spirit, it does change your view of the authority you're dealing with, which has acted in that way. It does make you more willing to accept what they tell you and more willing to have confidence in their decisions.
Absolutely. Maurice, it's been a wonderful conversation. Really enjoyed it. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I've enjoyed it as well.
That's all for today's episode of Guardians of Data. A huge thank you once again to Maurice Frankel for sharing his insights, experiences, and practical advice on freedom of information. His decades of work remind us how vital transparency is, not only for accountability, but also to maintain trust in public life. If you found today's discussion useful, please subscribe, share this podcast with colleagues, and leave us a review. And remember, whether you're a seasoned professional or just starting out in information governance, there's always more to learn, and we'll be here to help you every step of the way. Thanks for listening, and join us next time on Guardians of Data. This podcast is sponsored by Phase Law. Phase Law is purpose-built for document disclosures like subject access requests and FOI requests. Instead of redacting PDFs one by one or forcing litigation software to do a job it wasn't designed for, with Phase Law, you get collection, review, and redaction in one workflow. Teams across the world are using it to cut response times from weeks to days. And for Guardians of Data listeners, Phase Law is offering a 2-month free trial. Run it on live requests, see what it does to your backlog, decide from there. No card, no commitment. Head to phase.law/guardians to claim your free trial. That's phase.law/guardians.